Hey, PCCSC. This is Brad Shopketer. I'm the head coach for UCSB and the graduate vice president for the South for our conference. And I had the pleasure of putting together a schedule for this fall and a tentative schedule for this spring for our conference. We sent this out a while ago, Blaine did, but I want to review kind of the thought process in it. And what I'm going to do in this video is talk about the fall schedule, and then briefly show the spring schedule. And then if you want to watch the rest, I'll explain why. But in general, in a nutshell, they have redone the format for qualification to the national championship. And they've also redone the classification of teams. So the three kind of classifications are conference teams, and that's teams that really will not be able to travel outside the conference, because that's kind of what they do right now. And then there's a good chunk of our teams that do that, and that's totally fine. But usually this is a building program. And then the next step above that is regional. That's the teams in our conference. And those teams are allowed to travel, but they're allowed to travel to events that are really appropriate for their program skill level. So, you know, having gone to some East Coast events and traveled around the country over the past 10 years, I found that some are extraordinarily difficult, and you think you want to go to those ones until you finish like second to last or last, and you say, oh, wow, maybe I should have gone to something where I could have, you know, competed a little bit more. And I think the idea from a lot of the leadership of ICSA is that you want to be able to go to an event where you could compete and be in the top half. And it doesn't make sense to just go and grab a score line of poor finishes for the duration of a regatta. Teams don't learn that much from it. So there's regional regattas, and they're all over the country, and they're just more like mid to mid upper tier events. Then there's cross-regional. Cross-regional essentially are the premier teams in the country. I think there's like 40 of them, maybe less. So there's not that many. And those teams typically are teams that are showing up regularly at the semifinals and the finals of the national championships, and traveling and doing decently at events across the country. So, you know, you can imagine there's a handful of those schools in our conference. A lot of them are on the East Coast, but we definitely have our fair share in our conference as well. So those three tiers are then also expensed, meaning like cross-regional costs the most. And that's because the cross-regional teams will take the most resources of ICSA to go to all these events. Regional costs a little less, and conference teams cost the least. And that's so that you can give those teams a leg up as they build their programs. Another time, we can certainly go into where all of this is and how to understand more about it. I will show that later on in the presentation here. And then the second thing I want to talk about is that they changed because of this new, it's called 2021 and beyond. Essentially, they changed the qualification for the national championship. So we used to get 4 berths to the national championship for women's fleet racing and co-ed fleet racing. We used to get 2 for team racing. We used to get 1 for match racing, and I think like 2 for single-handed. And so now it's just the winner of team racing, match racing, and single-handed, and it's the top 2 for women's and co-ed fleet racing. The rest of the people, and that's for only 5 conferences. 2 of the conferences don't have automatic qualifiers, but our conference does. So the rest of the teams and how they get in is basically dependent on a selection committee. So similar to like the NCAA basketball tournament, there's a committee of 5 members roughly, and they come from kind of all avenues of college sailing. Not too many coaches are anticipated to be on that, if any at all. And they're going to look at, a competitive schedule and sort of say, hey, these teams are teams that should get in. So I want to talk a little bit about that after, but that's why the schedule has been reorganized. And before I get into it, I want to say quickly, the schedule has not been reorganized that much. So all of the important regattas that existed in our conference before still exist. The only thing that has really changed is these things. One, there's now a women's team race national championship. So we try to create women's team race events in our conference to coincide on the same weekend as a women's fleet racing event. So if you're going to a women's fleet racing event, the next day afterwards, we'd have a clinician-sponsored women's team race event. It's also important to understand that ICSA did not want to recognize women's team sailing in a co-ed event. You can do that, but you don't really earn points or views from the selection committee necessarily for those performances. So it's important to send women to a women's designated event. And you know, I was on that committee, but ultimately, if you disagree with these decisions, I understand, but they are what they are, and they may change in the future, but that's what it is now. So for like a women's team that wants to go to women's fleet race nationals, it's important that you attend women's fleet races, not co-ed fleet races with a women's team, unless you're practicing at that event. So that's important to understand. Okay, so without further ado, let's go ahead and look at the Pacific Coast Conference schedule for the fall. All right, so here we are. You have the the Pacific Coast Conference schedule for the fall. And almost all of this is vetted out except for these first 2 weekends. You'll see before even a lot of the core schools are in session. We don't know if the Standardford Invite, which is a top 6 teams in our conference, or the men and women single-handed, which weekend they'll be on. So they might flip-flop, but that's there. For those who don't know, it says week 2, week 3. This is based on the ICSA college schedule, not on our schedule for quarter schools. If you're a quarter school, this has everything to do with ICSA. So, so if you go to like scores.collegesailing.org, you know, you can see like at the very beginning they have like week 4 here, and that's not a great example. Like fall 19, we'll go fall 19. You can see like they have weekend 1 or whatever, and that was way back at the beginning of September. So weekend 1 happens before most of us are in session. Regardless, that's what these mean. A couple of notes. This very first line, it says week 2, stay in conference. Week 3, stay in conference. Week 4, travel weekend. Okay, and the idea behind this is to say that in a lot of the conferences that are doing really well, they have chosen weeks to say like, look, we're not going to host an event this weekend, or we're going to try to avoid hosting an event this weekend that's very important, or we'll take away a lot of our players, and we're going to say, hey, a lot of you should go ahead and travel across the country and do something on that weekend. You know, so it doesn't always work out perfect, but the idea is that this top heading kind of gives you an idea of what we're suggesting for teams to do. Okay, and you'll notice like week 6, it says in-conference events, none. So the in-conference events are in blue, out-of-conference events in purple. All right, so the only big changes to the schedule is that we might have a developmental fleet racing clinic here on October 2nd through 3rd, host to be determined, maybe Cal Poly, it sounded like. And we're still looking for a match race conference champs host. So this one I think could be potentially up in the air. The Stanford Invite, top 6. So one of the things that we're trying to do is with the qualification to nationals, as I mentioned, for fleet racing, they're going to look at your top 6 regattas for co-ed, and they're going to look at your top 5 for women's. Okay, so when you're selecting your events and how to spend your money, it depends on what you're looking to do. If you're saying, I want to make a run, we want to get in front of the selection committee's eyes, we want to be seen, that means you need to go to some competitive events. They've created a new system where they grade events 1 through 5, 1 being the hardest and 5 being the least hard. So like more of a developmental event, maybe like Frostoff. A 1 would be like the Danmark Trophy or Captain Hurst on the East Coast. And there is a 0, that's the Atlantic Coast Championship, but you have to qualify through a 1 regatta to get that. It's the only regatta that's a 0. So just kind of ignore that unless you have questions about it. That really probably applies to your top 2, maybe 3 teams in our conference. Other than that, it's grade 1s through 5. Grade 1 gives you the most points. Grade 5 gives you the least points. I'm going to show you just briefly what that looks like. So this is called a competitive strength ranking, points by grade. And you can see a grade 1, you get 18 points for first place, 17 for second, 16 for third, et cetera, down to 1 for 18th. If you get 19th or worse, you get a 0. So a grade 1 event has a multiplier of 6.5. Therefore, if you win a grade 1, you're going to get 117 points. Okay. If you got 8th at a grade 1, you would be better off going to a grade 2 and winning it by a half point, because you get 72 points for winning a grade 2. Just looking at UCSB as an example, we, I think, finished in a mock competitive strength record for co-ed fleet racing in 2019 with like 26th in the country. So top 36 is what they're kind of looking at. Well, top 50 really is what they're looking at when they're evaluating who they're going to look at for selection. And we did most of our best finishes came from doing well at a grade 2 or a grade 3. So if you were to go out and do 6 grade 3s and win all 6 of them, then you would be probably in the selection committee's eyes. The best case scenario is you go to as many grade 2s as you can in conference and grade 3s in conference, and then maybe try to hit a grade 2 out of conference and try to have your best finishes at those events. And then if you have like a terrible regatta, it doesn't matter. If you do 50 regattas, they're only going to look at your top 6. So they don't really care if you had this terrible regatta at a grade 2 on the East Coast. They're going to say, okay, just, you know, look at the best 6 they have. That'll get you into a competitive strength ranking where you'll say, okay, these teams are essentially who we're looking at as a selection committee. So again, backing up, you can get into the national championship by winning or getting 2nd place in fleet racing for co-ed or women's. But if you don't get in that way, say you finish 3rd in the co-ed fleet racing, you want to try to make sure you fill out your schedule with like grade 2s and grade 3s to try to get to that event. For those teams that are saying, well, we're still building, trust me, it's not worth trying to put yourself in a grade 1 or a grade 2 where you're going to get 2nd to last or 5th to last, because you will not succeed in the long run. Like, you won't get enough points. So you kind of got to focus on building your team at its skill level. And so what we're trying to do by creating a Stanford Invite top 6 is basically say, let's get our best 6 teams on the 6 schools on the water with 3 divisions. So that way you can say, oh, this is going to be a really 18 boats, very competitive. And that gives the chance for maybe a 4th or 5th or 6th place team in a school in our conference, like to come out and try to beat the very best 2 teams and get a really good score on their scorecard. Another comment about this is that if you choose to travel to a grade 2, so let's look at the ICSA interconference schedule. You can see it's right here. I'm going to send out links to all of this, but you can see like Sugar Bowl at Southern Yacht Club / Tulane in New Orleans is a grade 3. Well, that's the same as our Stony Brook. So that's just to keep that in mind. You might say, well, gosh, a grade 3, maybe we want to stay and just do Stony Brook instead. Not that it's on the same weekend, but just to keep it in mind. Here's the Danmark Trophy is a grade 1. The deal with a grade 1 and a grade 2, let's say at Danmark Trophy, nobody shows up. It's just like a bunch of, mediocre teams, and you go and win the Danmark. The score for the grade for the regatta cannot be downgraded. So if you go to a grade 2 and it's a grade 2 and there's nobody shows up, it's really like as easy as a grade 5 and you win the whole thing, you get a grade, it's still a grade 2. What can happen is if the teams are way more competitive, for instance, at Sugar Bowl, since Nationals is in New Orleans next year, maybe a bunch of great teams show up, like College of Charleston, for instance, is on here, right? So if Charleston shows up and a bunch of great Northeast teams show up and Stanford and a bunch of other good teams show up, you could find a situation where the Southern Sugar Bowl could be upgraded all the way to a 2, or I think it can even go higher, but it can be fully upgraded at least 1 full level. So it could become a 2.1 after the fact. It can never be downgraded. So when you spend your money to travel, you're guaranteed the minimum ranking of that regatta that you went to. Okay, so this can all be confusing, but if you look at it, Stony Brook and Stony Brook JV still exist. Okay, all of this, UCSD Open and the Frosh Soft exist. Little side note, Cal Maritime's thrown in a fall Harbor Cup in addition to a spring Harbor Cup. So a lot going on that weekend. The women's event, we're trying to make it into a women's fall PCCs on one day, on Saturday, where it's just a fleet race. And then on Sunday, we do a clinician-oriented team race for the women on Sunday. And then, here we have potentially a Gaucho Fall invite team race where we do the top 4 Pacific Coast teams. And what that means is the top 2 teams would send their best 2 squads, and the next 2 teams would send their best squad, and it would create a 6-team, very high level team race. I'll get into that a little bit more later, and that's one of the changes we're trying to do. And then finally, we're ending with our fall PCCs, and JV will exist as well. I know it says fall PCCs, but that includes JV. So really quickly, I think what's important to note on this sheet is down here, you've got the fall schedule, then you've got the spring schedule, then you've got this thing called team tiers. And so we put this together to try to explain, okay, so I'm a regional team. I'm mid-level in our conference. We do pretty well, but we've only traveled to a couple events, or maybe we've never traveled. But regardless, we're a pretty good team. We do mid-fleet in our conference. What regattas do I go to when I look at this thing? So weekend 1 and 2, you can see there's really nothing going on. We're saying for the tier 1 teams, you could do the Stanford Invite top 6. Weekend 3 is the single-handed champs, and we're saying stay local and sail the single-handed champs, send some teams to that. Or potentially, if you don't have a single-handed team, you can take the weekend off. Weekend 4, we're saying, hey, do that as a travel weekend. And I know Match Race Champs is on this, but in general, what you'll find is like, okay, for the tier 1 teams, they've got the Women's Atlantic Coast Championship, which is like borderline mandatory for those top teams. The Denmark and Moody are both good regattas that are tier 1, tier 2 kind of events. And they would be good events to travel to on the East Coast. And so I kind of put together like the Denmark's up here for cross-regional or tier 1 teams. And I've got the Moody down here, but not the Denmark, because the Denmark's really quite hard. So like the Moody is a good event to go to if you're like, well, I want to go to a competitive East Coast event on my first travel weekend, weekend 4, okay? But this is essentially like a menu, if you will, that you can choose from. You say, I'm tier 2, what are we going to do weekend 5? Oh, we want to send our A team to Stony Brook and our B team to Stony Brook JV. And for like the tier 1 groups, we want to send our co-ed best team to the Atlantic Coast Championship. We're going to send our B team, though, to Stony Brook so that we can make that event locally as competitive as possible. So Stony Brook will hopefully be important. Same thing for fundamental or conference teams. You'll see the Stony Brook is like send your A team, etc. And essentially, this is a menu of what you could do on each weekend and what we are suggesting. You don't have to do any of this. We're not saying you have to do it. We're saying it makes a lot of sense. So try to plan your schedule this way. I want to offer my assistance. ucsbsailingcoach@gmail.com is my email. Again, that's ucsbsailingcoach@gmail. And I would reach out to me. I'm happy to walk you through what you might do. I'm going to go back to our spring schedule now. A couple other major changes that have happened is that we didn't really have enough women's events. As I said earlier, they're going to look at your top 6 co-ed events. They're going to look at your top 5 women's fleet race events. So I'm making some proposed changes that are slightly aggressive, or I wouldn't call them radical, but one is to make the Jeff Simon event in late January a women's event. So there will still be a JV or co-ed event, but that is priority 2. And so like when you do this, you want to take all your women and say, listen, we've got to give them the tiller. We've got to get them on the line, as many teams as we can on that weekend, and have 2 guys sail together heavy. We'll all be doing it. So you can have a great time. You can still have that social element at Jeff Simon, but we can honor our women sailors, the fastest growing demographic in our sport, by having that women's event and giving us one more local in-conference event so that we can build our women's ability to potentially qualify or get in the eyes of the selection committee. So that's one of them. We also are recommending that for the Mustang. So there'd be a Mustang women's, where women's the priority, and a co-ed, and a Mustang JV. So the idea being is that we would try to break that up and say, okay, the Mustang guys are going to all sail kind of together, and the women are going to sail together, and that will give the women a women's only event. And again, we're doing this because having women sail in a co-ed event does not count. That is the ICSA's determinations. We have to have women's events. Okay. The other major change, as I mentioned, the Bryson Women's is a fleet race on day 1, and it'll be a team race on day 2 with a clinician there. So we're trying to create women's team race opportunities because there's a women's team race national championship. So we need to start training our women skippers to team race more often. Okay. The final thing that's changed for the spring, we're attempting to change, is to have 2 team races on a weekend in a given sort of area. So like in Central Coast, we have the Gaucho Spring Invite team race on the first weekend in February. That's going to be top 4. That means the top 2 teams in the conference, top 2 schools in the conference send their top 2 teams. And then the next 2 best schools send their top team. That'll create a 6-team team race regatta that's very competitive and hard to win. That'll give opportunities for those teams, A, to learn, and B, to create sort of some some views in front of the selection committee's eyes. The Mustang team race would be the same weekend, same sort of general area, the Central Coast, and would basically bring the next 6 teams in to team race at that venue. So it would be more of a clinician-sponsored learning event. Hopefully, as time goes on, we'll build one where the top 6 and the next 6, it's 6 schools and 6 schools. Right now, we're suggesting 4 schools with 6 teams, and then the next 6. So that's 10 schools in our conference having team race opportunities on that weekend, and the same thing on the next weekend, a CMA team race, and then a Cal team race that would be clinician sponsored for the next 6. So top 4, next 6. After that, we will have potentially a Bryson women's team race, probably be the conference championships for women's team racing. We have to talk about that a little bit, but the spring schedule is still a little bit in flux. In general, though, PCCSC South designate, PCCSC North designate, same weekends, same exact things. So not too much has changed. And I think the most important thing is to understand that, we'll send out updates about this for the in-conference stuff. I will put a team tier schedule together for the spring shortly, but that is it in a nutshell. I'll show you the strata grade coverage. So what I tried to do was look at how many, co-ed fleet races do we have in our conference, how many women's fleet race, how many co-ed team races, how many women's team races, and we just really didn't have like a ton of women's events. So that's why we took the Jeff Simon and the Mustang and changed them into women's events, essentially. We also took the co-ed fleet races, and that obviously we still have the Jeff Simon and Mustang, but you'll see it. I've got the grade coverage here and the hope for the grade coverage, 3 to 4 grade 2s, 4 to 6 grade 3s, maybe 2 grade 4s, and the rest of them would be grade 5s. Okay. So a lot of information here, obviously, but I think what's important right now is to say, here's my schedule for the fall. I'm a mid-level team in this conference. Where do I go? And we have this kind of thing lined up here about where you might try to go. So hopefully this is helpful. I want to show you one last thing. And for those of you who have listened too long and say, I don't want to watch this anymore, that's fine. I do want to show you how all of this competitive strength ranking and things like that works. And before I go into it one more time, I'm just going to repeat, to qualify for nationals for co-ed fleet racing, you have to be 1st or 2nd in our conference championship, or you are going to be looked at by a selection committee based on your top 6 regattas that you perform at. So you want to make sure you go to at least 6 events in the year if you're serious about trying to go to nationals, or if you're women's team, it's going to be top 5 regattas. And the regatta grading is listed on our sheet right here. So it says 1, that's a cross regional. This is 2, it's a regional, 2 regional, 4 regional. Okay. You've got the Stony Brook is 3, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So you can look at it. It's got the grade, target grade, and the classification. Is it a regional, cross regional, or a conference event? Okay. And then it's got what kind of berths are allowed at each event. Right there. So how many from the mid-Atlantic, the Northeast, the Midwest, Pacific Coast, South Atlantic, Southeast, et cetera, Northwest, et cetera. Okay, so the team race, just for the record, on women's and co-ed team racing, you have to race 1 team race regatta to be in the selection committee's eyes. Obviously, it'll probably take more than that to get into nationals if you don't win our conference championship. Only 1 goes from automatic qualifier or from winning our conference championship. The same is true with match racing. The same is true with single-handed. So you got to win our conference championship or be sort of, have done well enough to be looked at by the selection. All right, so I'm going to share where to find all that information. So if you're bored and you say, I'm good, got it, Brad, I know what to do now. And this is the ICSA. Also, I'm going to send out the link for this. This is the ICSA interconference thing. So you can kind of already see who's signed up for a lot of these events, and the actual rankings. You might want to double check everything I've got on my sheet is exactly the same as this when you pick your regattas. And when you do pick your regattas, Blaine will send this out for selection for what you want out of conference only. Okay, so to find all this stuff and how this new system works, break, if you're bored, you can sign off. This is how it works. You go to collegesailing.org, resources, meeting minutes and docs, and you'll come to this page and you'll see our most recent meeting. And you can click on ICSA Championship Competition Committee Report. that's this thing here where I kind of showed you how the competitive strength works for fleet racing. But it goes through everything from team racing and how it's going to work, etc. Additionally, it has a PowerPoint to understand the fleet racing selection method. So there will be 5 voting members, and there's going to be a parliamentarian or somebody who makes sure the committee does things correctly. There's some limitation. Coaches are permitted, but they can't discuss or vote their own team. So that kind of is a real negative for coaches being on this. They would never be able to vote on their team whatsoever. And you can kind of go through this. It just says who is allowed to be on this committee, the selection committee. So the competitive strength ranking is essentially like, again, your best 6 regattas. And what it does is it allows us as teams on the Pacific Coast to decide if we're going to go out of conference, how to spend our money. So we have these graded events and we say, I want to spend my money wisely. I'm going to go to a grade 1 event. When you show up, it doesn't get looked at more poorly because nobody showed up to the event or nobody good showed up to the event. It's going to be a grade 1 no matter what. No penalty for 4 opponents, but it can be increased in value. So it helps the selection committee a little bit because they're going to be able to look at it. So the conference will submit our schedule with our anticipated grading for the events, for our in-conference events. We still need to do that, but that's what we're going to do. The grading is released for all events, and the championship committee, which I and Blaine are on, help with the grading of events and kind of confirm those grades. The team schedule the events and they have full knowledge of ranking values. So you say, okay, if I go to this grade 2, I get a first place. I'm going to get 18 points times 6.5. That's the multiplier. That will give me event points for that event. Also, they're hoping to release those point totals, I believe, at the end of the fall and like one time in the spring. So people kind of have a vibe for where they are. Points are awarded for each event and they're based on finishing place times the event grade multiplier. It's the top 6 events for each co-ed team and the top 5 events for each women's teams. All teams are ranked high to low. That's it. That's it. Finishing place in event times event grading factor equals total event score. You add up your top 6 scores. There's your number. And they just list us all in biggest score to lowest. Okay, so it's strength-based, it's transparent, it's very transparent. You know where you stand. So in the selection committee's eyes, if you show up and you're 10th in the competitive strength ranking, and somehow or another you don't get selected because you're not a normal nationals team, like you have a really good team that year, the committee would be remiss to do that. It would look at a 10th place finisher in the competitive strength ranking and say, they need to be in. And it would be hard to imagine them not putting somebody in. It could create, great concern within the selection committee if they did that. But it also allows somebody who's 43rd, and I'm going to use Hawaii as an example. Let's say Hawaii just can't travel to 6 out of off the island events, right? They're going to go to the Peter Wenner Memorial, then they got to go to 5 more, and then 5 more women's events. That's tough. So ultimately, what they need to do is they have to say, okay, well, maybe they go to their only 4 events that are on the mainland. And the committee can say, oh, well, Hawaii ranks 43rd, but if you look at the 5 events they went to, they got a 0 in their 6th event because they didn't show up to one. They did so well in these 5 events. They clearly, from 43rd, even though they're not the top 36, should be bumped up. So it allows some subjectivity to make sure nobody's missed. I'll put it that way, okay? So round 1 is the top 2 teams from the conference championships. There's 7 conferences in the country, and 5 of them get automatic qualifiers from the conference championships. We're one of those conferences. The top 2 advance. Round 2 is lock teams. So the selection committee will vote if 80% of the team members of the selection committee, that's 4 out of 5 of them, vote that a team should be locked into the national championship. And they're saying, look at this, like this team's 10th in the competitive strength ranking, look at all their finishes, et cetera, and everybody votes for them to be in, then they're locked, okay? Then the interesting part happens. So this is an example. So the first round, 10 teams get in. There's 36 spots for the national fleet racing. The next round, the committee votes 12 in. This is just a hypothetical example, okay? What they do after that is they say, okay, we have 22 teams that have gotten in, and we have now 14 berths left to allocate, okay? And so then what they'll do is they'll take the next double that, 28 teams, okay? And then they kind of go through this process where they're going to vote the top portion of those teams and the top portion of those teams, et cetera. So let's do an example round. So round one, conference champions. So in this situation, in the competitive strength ranking, number 40 finished second or whatever in their conference champs. Just like, why did number 40 get in, number 34, et cetera? That's because those teams finished top 2 in their conference championships. So that's how that looks. Those 10 teams got in because they got first and second in the conference championship. Round 2, this is the 12 teams that were selected by 80% of the selection committee. They were voted in. So they say the number 2 team in the conference or the country definitely should be in. We're going to vote them in, and you can look. So it's like number 1, number 2 didn't get in, right? So number 2, 5, 6, and they voted 8 in, and 9 and 10 and 11. And so they're kind of getting all these ones who finished 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th at their conference championships that are really good teams. And they kind of got to the point of like 21, right? So right around 22, they got these 3 got in from those automatic qualifiers, but 21 is kind of where they decided to stop. 3 plus is all remaining teams. So selection of remaining 14 berths. So here's the teams that have not gotten into nationals yet. The top 28 teams are these. So that's 41 plus, but it ends up being 41 through 50. That's the top 28 teams. So they're going to take double the remaining 14 berths, and then they're going to vote essentially which ones they think are best. They're going to actually rank them, right? So then the committee averages all their rankings of all those 28 teams, and they say this is the ranking that came out. The highest top third advances. So here's the top third of those 28 teams gets in. They're in, okay? But there's still more to do. This is kind of just a reiteration of what's said before. Again, you can look through all this on your own. And it just goes on and on and on like that to get more and more berths, okay? So essentially what happens is it's going to say, okay, like we're going to take our next next double the amount left. So if you say, okay, we had 14 berths available, we did 8 more, so there's only 6 left. So we'll take the next 12 teams, average those teams, and then take the top third of that, and so on and so on and so forth until they're voting on really just the last team. And they'll be looking at like 4 teams for 1 spot. So it allows you as a team to have the power to be in your hands to say, we're going to be up that competitive strength ranking, which will give you some level of fully objective strength ranking that you can control. You go to a certain regatta, you choose the regatta, you sail well with the regatta, and you are not overlooked because you are in that competitive strength ranking as such. The subjectivity part of it is to essentially allow for any mistakes that might be made in that ranking. Like, for instance, again, Hawaii is a great example, a team being overlooked because they literally live on an island and it's expensive to fly all the time, right? So they can look at that team and say, well, they're in the competitive strength ranking as number 50 even. But we really truly believe, based on the 3 regattas they attended that they won, they should be in the national championship. So there's a level of saying, okay, they can get in. All right. And the same things for the women's. One last comment on the women's is that every women's event is guaranteed a minimum grade of a grade 3 in our conference to start with. And that's because they're trying to give us sort of a developmental time frame to build up our women's fleet racing. And I think the same may be true with women's team racing. But regardless, right now, I think the goal is to create women's team racing opportunities in our conference that are clinician sponsored. We want to create women's fleet racing opportunities in our conference so more teams can have the opportunity to be seen by the selection committee. We want to create higher level events in our conference where the top teams can get better graded events in conference as opposed to having to travel across the country to the East Coast. And we want to also create learning structure for the mid and lower level teams. So our developmental team race events to create a better team race format in our conference. The goal here really in the long run is that we don't have to travel that much. That's the goal, is try to not travel that much, actually have us stay in conference and focus on certain things. So coming full circle to this, when you're making your selection for what events you want to go to on each weekend, you want to look at how many teams can we send? Only one? Okay, great. What does it say? It says week 5, stay in conference. Team tiers. Okay, week 5, we're going to stay local. Week 6, we're going to travel. Do we want to go to the David Lee Arnoff or the Savin Hill? Okay, and you can review what grades those are on the fall schedule or on the ICSA interconference schedule. I'd like, again, to make myself fully available to you and the rest of anybody in the conference that needs help. Again, emails ucsbsailingcoach@gmail.com. I apologize for the lengthiness of this, but I hope you found it helpful. We will do regatta selections shortly for the out of conference events. That means anything that's not in the Pacific Coast. I think that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to email Blaine, our conference commissioner, or myself. I think Blaine's email is bpedlow@gmail. So anyway, we can look that up, but I think you probably have it. So great. All right. Thank you very much, guys. We'll see you at the next conference meeting and in the fall. Thanks.